There are many ways to betray an empire. You can turn your weapons against it. You can assassinate its leaders. You can open the gates to its enemies. You can burn its worlds. You can declare war. But there is another kind of betrayal, a quieter one, the kind that begins with a question. What if everything you taught was a lie? What if your father was not who you believed him to be? What if the universe was not empty? What if the gods were real? And what if they were listening? After Monarchia, Lorgar Aurelian had lost everything that had once given his life meaning. His city was gone. His faith in the Emperor was shattered. His legion had been humiliated. And the Emperor had made one thing absolutely clear. He was not a god. Lorgar had spent his entire life searching for something worthy of worship. Now his father had told him that the object of his devotion was merely a man. So Lorgar did what he'd always done when faced with uncertainty. He searched for an answer. He searched the stars. He searched the ancient religions of Colchis. He searched the forbidden corners of the galaxy. And eventually, he looked into the warp. The warp looked back, and the beings waiting there had been watching humanity for a very long time. They did not need Lorgar to hate the Emperor. They did not need him to desire power. They did not even need him to want revenge. They needed only one thing, for Lorgar to believe. Because the Word-Bearers had spent decades teaching humanity to worship, now they were about to learn how to worship chaos. And when they returned from their pilgrimage, they would not merely become servants of the dark gods. They would become their missionaries, their prophets, their architects, their first great army within the Imperium, the legion that would teach the other traitors how to fall. Our story begins where the last episode ended. Monarchia is dead. The city that Lorgar built as a monument to the Emperor has been destroyed. The 17th Legion has been publicly humiliated, and Lorgar has been forced to kneel before his father. The moment is one of the most important scenes in the entire Horus heresy. Not because Lorgar becomes a traitor that day, he doesn't, not yet. Instead, something more dangerous happens. Lorgar's certainty disappears. For most of his life, Lorgar had possessed an answer. He believed the universe had purpose. He believed mankind had a destiny. He believed the Emperor was the divine center of that destiny. And because he believed that, he could endure almost anything. The Great Crusade, war, death, the suffering of conquered worlds, the destruction of old civilizations. All of it could be justified because Lorgar believed it was part of something greater. Then the Emperor told him, there is no God here. There is only the Imperium, only mankind, only reason. And Lorgar was left with a problem. If the Emperor was not divine, what was? The 17th Legion. To understand the Word-Bearers' fall, we need to go further back. Before they were called the Word-Bearers, the 17th Legion was known as the Imperial Heralds. Their original purpose was almost the exact opposite of what they would eventually become. They were agents of the Imperial Truth. The Imperial Heralds were sent to worlds that resisted the Great Crusade. They destroyed idols, they broke temples, they opposed superstition, they fought against religions that resisted imperial compliance. They were in many ways missionaries of atheism, and their primarch was found. Lorgar Aurelian, a child of Colchis, a world where religion was not merely part of society, religion was society. Lorgar had been raised amongst prophets, priests, and sacred texts. He learned to interpret the world through faith. He believed that existence itself had meaning. When the Emperor came to Colchis, Lorgar believed he had finally found the answer. The Emperor was not simply a ruler. He was the object towards which all belief had been pointing. Lorgar's legion changed. The Imperial Heralds became the Word-Bearers. Their old mission was transformed. They would still conquer worlds, but now they would also explain why those worlds should worship the Emperor. And that was where the problem began, because the Emperor did not want worship. The word bearers were not disobedient because they didn't understand the Imperial Truth. They were disobedient because Lorgar believed the Imperial Truth was incomplete. That distinction is everything. Lorgar's first great mistake. Lorgar believed there had to be a greater truth. The Emperor told him that there wasn't, or at least that humanity should not concern itself with such questions. The warp was dangerous, psychers were dangerous, superstition was dangerous. The Emperor believed humanity needed to master itself before it could safely confront the deeper realities of existence. Lorgar disagreed. And eventually his disagreement became doctrine. The word bearers began building temples, they created monuments, they spread sermons, they converted entire populations, and they became increasingly slow. This is important, because Lorgar's failure was not military. His legion was extraordinarily powerful. The problem was that the word bearers were spending enormous amounts of time turning compliance into conversion. The Emperor wanted a united galaxy, Lorgar wanted a believing galaxy, and eventually the Emperor decided that the distinction had to be made brutally clear. Monarchia. The moment after Monarchia. After the destruction of Monarchia, Lorgar withdrew. The Primarch, who had always preached certainty, became silent. His legion waited. His closest followers watched him, and among those followers were two men who would become central to the fate of the galaxy, Kor Phaeron and Erebus. To understand why they mattered, we need to understand what they knew, because Lorgar was searching for something new. Erebus and Kor Phaeron were already familiar with the old. They understood Colchisian religion, they understood ritual, they understood the power of belief, and more importantly, they understood how easily belief could become a weapon. Kor Phaeron. Kor Phaeron's story begins before the Imperium. He was a religious figure on Colchis, a priest, a man who saw something unusual in the child Lorgar. Potential, charisma, something almost impossible to define. Kor Phaeron took Lorgar under his influence, but Lorgar eventually surpassed him. The student became greater than the teacher, and when the Emperor arrived, Lorgar's old religious world was transformed. Kor Phaeron followed him, eventually becoming one of the most important figures in the Word Bearers. But Kor Phaeron had never lost his understanding of faith. He understood that belief was not merely something people possessed, it was something that could be controlled and direct, manipulated, and after Monarchia, Lorgar needed direction. Erebus. Then there was Erebus. If Lorgar was the philosopher, Erebus was the conspirator. And if Lorgar wanted answers, Erebus knew where to look. And if Lorgar needed to believe, Erebus was prepared to give him something to believe in. Erebus had already exposed to ancient beliefs and forbidden traditions. He had learned about the warrior lodges. He understood secret societies. He understood ritual. He understood the power of brotherhood, and eventually he would become one of the most important agents of chaos in the entire Horus heresy. But Erebus did not begin by telling Lorgar, abandon the Emperor. That would have failed. Instead, he encouraged Lorgar to ask questions. Questions that the Imperial Truth could not answer. What is the warp? Why do psychic phenomena exist? Why do ancient human religions share similar symbols? Why do so many cultures claim that beings exist beyond the material universe? Why does the warp respond to emotion? Why do sacrifices sometimes produce results? Why do visions sometimes come true? And above all, if gods do not exist, why does the warp behave as though they do? The Word-Bearer's Second Crusade. The Emperor had told Lorgar to stop preaching, so Lorgar did something unexpected. He stopped, at least publicly. The Word-Bearers accelerated their campaigns, they conquered worlds, destroyed resistance, they became brutally efficient. From the outside it appeared that the lesson had worked. The Word-Bearers had finally learned what the Emperor wanted, but beneath the surface something else was happening. The Legion was becoming more fanatical, secretive, ritualistic, and more interested in what lay beyond the material universe. The faith had not died. It had merely changed direction. The search for gods. Lorgar began searching for the truth. He did not immediately know what he was looking for, but he knew where he wanted to begin: the old religions, the ancient knowledge of Colchis, the forgotten traditions of humanity, the records that the Imperium had dismissed as superstition, and eventually the warp. Lorgar's search is important because it shows us exactly how chaos works. Chaos rarely says, everything you believe is wrong. Instead, it says, everything you believe was almost right. That is far more dangerous. The Word-Bearers had spent years believing the Emperor was divine. Chaos could take that belief and redirect it. The Emperor was not a god, but gods did exist. Therefore, the Word-Bearers had simply worshipped the wrong one. The pilgrimage. The Word-Bearers began their pilgrimage, and this is where the story changes from political tragedy to cosmic horror. They began traveling toward the edges of the material universe, away from established worlds of the Great Crusade, away from imperial authority, away from the comforting certainty of the Imperial Truth, and towards places where reality itself became unstable. The Word-Bearers were searching for evidence. They found it. The further they traveled, the more evidence they discovered that the warp contained things that could not simply be dismissed as superstition. Ancient entities, warp phenomena, demonology, ritual possession, and eventually, the Eye of Terror. The eye that looked back. The Eye of Terror is not merely a location, it is a wound. A place where the warp and the material universe overlap. A place where reality becomes unreliable, where the rules of physics cease to behave, where thought can become substance, where emotion can become power, and where things that should not exist can exist. Lorgar looked into that darkness, and the darkness looked back. The Word-Bearers had spent their entire existence trying to find the truth. Now they were standing at the edge of it, and the truth was not what they expected. The warp was alive, responsive, and populated. The entities within it could provide answers. Ingethel. Then came Ingethel, a demon, an entity that would become one of the most important guides in the Word-Bearer's transformation. Ingethel did not simply attack the Legion. It offered knowledge, revelation. It offered Lorgar something he had wanted his entire life. Proof. Proof that there were beings beyond the material universe. Proof that humanity's ancient religions had not been entirely meaningless. Proof that the Emperor had been wrong about one of the most important questions in existence. There were gods, and they were real. But Ingethel did not tell Lorgar the whole truth, because chaos never does. The Four. The Word-Bearers discovered the four great powers: Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh. Four entities, four aspects of the warp. Four different expressions of the emotional and psychic energy generated by sentient beings. Blood, change, decay, excess. The Word-Bearers were fascinated because Lorgar did not see 4 unrelated gods. He saw a greater cosmic system, a pantheon, a truth, a structure, and eventually he would call this truth Chaos Undivided. The word bearers would not belong exclusively to one god. They would serve all 4, or so they believed. The Gal Vorbak. But someone had to go first. Someone had to prove that the barrier between humanity and the warp could be broken. That someone was Argel Tal. Argel Tal was not some ancient cultist. He was an Astartes, a warrior of the 17th Legion, a son of Lorgar, a believer in the Emperor, and eventually a vessel. Argel Tal and his warriors entered the Eye. They crossed into a place where the material universe no longer behaved normally. And when they returned, they were no longer entirely alone. Demons had entered them, not merely possessing them temporarily, but bonding with them, sharing their bodies and their minds. The result came back and was called the Gal Vorbak, the Blessed Ones, possessed Space Marines. This was revolutionary. The word bearers had discovered that the warp could be weaponized through human flesh. And they had discovered something even more important. The relationship between demon and Astartes did not necessarily have to be a simple possession. It could be a cooperation, a terrible cooperation, but cooperation nonetheless. The Gal Vorbak was stronger, faster, more resilient, and utterly changed. The Imperium had spent millennia warning humanity about the dangers of the warp. Now the word bearers had learned how to bring the warp into themselves. Argel Tal. Argel Tal is one of the most tragic figures in this entire story. Because he does not begin as a monster, he begins as a warrior trying to understand what has happened to his legion. He follows Lorgar because he trusts him. He follows the pilgrimage because he believes there is a greater purpose, and eventually he becomes one of the first Astartes to cross the boundary between man and demon. The experience changes him, but it also gives him something the Emperor could never give the word bearers: an answer. The warp is real, the gods are real, the universe has meaning, and the meaning is terrifying. Lorgar's revelation. Lorgar's search eventually becomes something deeper. He does not merely discover chaos, he begins to understand it, and that is where Lorgar becomes more dangerous than almost any other Primarch. Horus will become the War Master of the rebellion, Angron will become the weapon of Khorne, Fulgrim will descend into Slaanesh, Mortarion will become the champion of Nurgle, Magnus will bind himself to Tzeentch, but Lorgar becomes the theologian of chaos. He wants to understand why gods exist, why they want, what they want, how they influence reality, how humanity can communicate with them, and how their power can be brought into the material universe. He doesn't merely want to serve chaos, he wants to explain chaos. The word bearers become something else. This is the point where the 17th Legion truly changes. The old word bearers had built temples to the Emperor, the new word bearers would build temples to chaos. The old word bearers had preached, the new word bearers would summon. The old word bearers had converted worlds, the new word bearers would prepare worlds for sacrifice. The difference was not the Legion's devotion, it was the object of that devotion. And this is why the word bearers are so important to understanding chaos. They demonstrate that fanaticism itself is not necessarily the source of corruption. The word bearers did not stop believing, they believed harder, deeper. They simply changed what they believed in. The Serrated Sun. One of the most important stages in this transformation involved the serrated sun chapter, Argel Tal's warriors. They became the foundation of the Gal Vorbak. They were among the first Astartes to embrace possession deliberately, and they became living proof of the Wordbearer's new theology. The warp was not merely an enemy, it was a resource, a power, a revelation, and eventually a weapon. The first heretic. This is where Aaron Dembski Bowden's The First Heretic becomes one of the foundational texts of the modern Horus heresy. Black Library itself describes the novel as the story of the Wordbearer's transformation after the Emperor's chastisement, their search for a new purpose, and their eventual encounter with the powers of chaos. And that is important because the novel reframes the heresy. The question is no longer, why did Horus betray the Emperor? Instead, the question becomes, how did the entire structure of the rebellion become possible? And the answer is the Wordbearers. They were there before Horus fell. They were experimenting with chaos before Horus understood what was happening. They were spreading the warrior lodges, manipulating their brothers, preparing the ideological ground. The heresy was not simply a rebellion that chaos later exploited. Chaos had been preparing the rebellion for years. The lodges. The warrior lodge. On the surface, it was innocent, a brotherhood, a place where warriors could speak outside the rigid hierarchy of the Legion, a place where they could share stories, drink, remember their humanity, but the lodges had another advantage. They created networks outside official Legion command, and that made them incredibly useful. The Wordbearers understood this. They had encountered lodge traditions during the Great Crusade, and they adopted them. They spread them. The lodges crossed Legion boundaries. They created friendships and trust, secret conversations, eventually becoming conspiracies. The modern Warhammer community account explicitly connects the Wordbearers, Erebus, and the spread of the lodges to the latter corruption of the other legions. The rot did not begin when Horus was wounded. The rot was already spreading and establishing itself through the lodges. The Architects. This is why the Wordbearers deserve the title, the First Traitors. Not because they were the first legion to openly declare rebellion, they weren't, but because they were among the first to consciously embrace the powers that would make rebellion possible. Lorgar provided the theology, Erebus provided the manipulation, Kor Phaeron provided the old religious machinery, Argel Tal and the Gal Vorbak provided the proof, and Chaos provided the power. Together they created something the Emperor had never anticipated, a legion that believed treason could be holy. Lorgar and Horus. Eventually Lorgar looked toward Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's favourite son, the man who had the greatest influence over the legions. If the Imperium was going to be transformed, Horus was the key, but Lorgar had a problem. Horus did not yet understand chaos. He did not need it. He was proud, powerful, loved by his legion, and deeply trusted by the Emperor. So the Wordbearers waited, they watched, they prepared, and when the opportunity finally came, they were ready. Darwin. Eventually the Great Crusade brought the Lunar Wolves and the Wordbearers into direct contact with Darwin. The Lunar Wolves moved on, the Wordbearers remained, and there they encountered the warrior lodges. This would become one of the greatest turning points of the entire heresy. The lodges had already become corrupted. Erebus understood their value, and later years after Horus was wounded by the anathema blade, Erebus would use the lodge system to reach him. He would enter Horus's mind, he would show him a vision of the future, a vision designed to convince Horus that the Emperor intended to discard the Primarchs, that the Emperor would eventually become God, and that the Space Marines would be destroyed. That Horus had been betrayed. The modern Warhammer community account explicitly identifies Erebus, the Davenite Lodge, and the Tainted Blade as central components of the Horus heresy's corruption, and this is where the Wordbearers' influence becomes undeniable. They didn't merely worship chaos, they taught others how to fall. The Great Lie. Erebus showed Horus something that was partly true, and that is why it worked. The Emperor did have secrets. The Emperor did conceal the truth about the warp. The Emperor did have plans for the Primarchs. The Emperor did possess knowledge that he refused to share, and the future of the Primarchs was uncertain, but Erebus took those truths and built a lie around them. That is the genius of chaos. The lie does not have to be completely false. It only needs to be true enough. Lorgar's place in the heresy. Lorgar was now standing at the center of something much larger than himself. He had discovered the gods, he had begun corrupting his legion, he had helped spread the lodges, and he had begun influencing Horus, but Lorgar still had another problem. He believed that Horus was not simply going to rebel, he believed Horus was going to transform the Imperium, a new order, new religion, and new humanity. Lorgar imagined that the rebellion could have meaning, purpose, a divine destiny, and perhaps that was his greatest mistake, because Horus did not see the heresy in quite the same way. Argel Tal and Khan. The Wordbearers also found an unlikely ally, the World Eaters, and specifically Khan. Argel Tal and Khan developed a remarkable friendship. Two warriors from legions that could not have been any more different. One devoted to theology, one devoted to war. One searching for divine meaning, one increasingly consumed by rage. And yet they respected one another. Their friendship became one of the strangest relationships in the entire heresy, because it demonstrated something important. The traitor legions were not always united by ideology. Sometimes they were united by brotherhood, and sometimes the brotherhood was the last thing keeping them human. The Shadow Crusade. Eventually Lorgar would unleash his Shadow Crusade. The Wordbearers and World Eaters would tear through Ultramar. World after world, city after city, population after population. And this is where the story comes full circle. The Legion that once built cities learned how to destroy them. The Legion that once preached faith in the Emperor now preached faith in chaos. And the Primarch who had once wanted humanity to worship his father now wanted humanity to worship the gods of the warp. The Shadow Crusade was not simply a military campaign. It was a religious war. A holy war. Kelth. And then came Kelth. The Ultramarines believed they were meeting the Wordbearers as allies. The Wordbearers arrived with another purpose. The old wound of Monarchia had never healed. Guilliman had been there. The Ultramarines had destroyed the city, and now the Wordbearers had the power to strike back. But revenge alone was not the goal. Kelth was part of something much larger. A ritual, a catastrophe, a way to wound Ultramar, and a way to tear open the warp. The battle would become one of the defining events of the Horus heresy, but that belongs to a later episode. Because right now we need to understand something. Kelth did not create the Wordbearers. Kelth revealed what they had become. The Wordbearers' true victory. The Wordbearers' greatest victory was not a battlefield victory. It was ideological. They proved that the Emperor's dream could be turned against itself. The Great Crusade had united humanity, but it had also spread the legions across the galaxy. The Imperial Truth had attempted to destroy religion, but it also created populations hungry for meaning. The Emperor had created demigods, then expected humanity to treat them as soldiers, and the Primarchs themselves were not gods, but they were powerful enough to become objects of worship. The Word-Bearers understood that. They understood something the Emperor had underestimated. Humanity wants meaning, and if you destroy one religion, people will build another. Chaos does not need everyone. The Word-Bearers also reveal another important truth about chaos. Chaos does not require everyone to worship the same god. Khorne does not need Lorgar, Tzeentch does not need Lorgar, Nurgle does not need Lorgar, and neither does Slaanesh. What chaos needs is access, weakness, a belief, a desire, fear, and a wound, something that can be turned. For Lorgar it was faith, for Fulgrim it would be perfection, for Mortarion it would be hatred and endurance, for Angron rage, for Magnus knowledge, for Perturabo resentment, for Kurz fatalism, and for Horus pride, fear, and betrayal. The Word-Bearers were simply the first to understand the pattern. The record changes. Old lore. The history of the Word-Bearers has changed considerably over the decades. Older Warhammer 40K material established many of the broad strokes. Lorgar, the Word-Bearers, the worship of chaos, the betrayal, the heresy. But the modern Horus history expanded the story dramatically. The first heretic gave us much more intimate account of Monarchia and the psychological transformation of the Legion. Later works expanded the roles of Erebus, Kor Phaeron, Argel Tal, and the Gal Vorbak. The Black Books added military history and context, and modern Warhammer community material now explicitly presents the 17th Legion as the original architects of the heresy. The official Black Books material identifies the Legion's original name as the Imperial Heralds and describes their journey from spreading the Imperial Truth to seeking powers that would accept their worship. That means the modern Word-Bearer's story is not simply Lorgar becomes evil. It's Lorgar searches for truth as Legion follows him. Erebus manipulates the search, Chaos provides the answers. The answers come from doctrine, the doctrine becomes conspiracy, the conspiracy becomes rebellion. That is much more complicated a story, and it is the version that we will follow. The record changes with Lorgar. There is another important evolution, Lorgar's portrayal. Early portrayals could make him appear almost entirely responsible for his own damnation. The modern novels make the tragedy much more personal. Lorgar is not stupid, he's not simply weak or power-hungry, he is intelligent, charismatic, philosophical, and genuinely desperate to understand existence. That makes his fall far more disturbing, because Lorgar is not tricked because he is incapable of thinking, he is tricked because he thinks deeply about the wrong questions with the wrong people and trusts the wrong answers. The record changes with Erebus. Erebus has also become more significant in modern lore. He's not merely one of the Word-Bearers who happened to fall. He is an architect, and an active one. A manipulator, a recruiter, a corrupter, a man who understands that the heresy must be prepared before it can be fought. His influences reach way beyond the Word-Bearers. He becomes involved with Horus, the warrior lodges, the anathema, the corruption of the War Master, and the broader conspiracies surrounding the traitor legions. Warhammer community's own modern summaries explicitly describe the Word-Bearers as involved in Horus's betrayal from the beginning, and state that it is reasonable to trace the origins of the Horus heresy into the 17th Legion itself. That is an enormous statement, because it changes the way we should understand the Horus heresy. The question is no longer, when did Horus start the heresy? The better question is, when did their heresy become inevitable? And perhaps it was already moving before Horus ever knew what was happening. The first traitors. The word bearers earned their reputation. They were the first legion to truly embrace the gods. They were the first to understand the usefulness of demons. They helped spread the lodges. They prepared the way for Horus. They helped create the conditions for rebellion. And they would eventually tear open the galaxy itself. But there is a final irony. The word bearers believed they had discovered the truth. They believed chaos represented the deeper reality of existence. And in some ways they were right. The warp is real. The gods are real. The supernatural is real. The Imperial Truth was incomplete. But being right about the existence of something does not mean you understand it. And Lorgar did not understand chaos. Not yet. The price of knowledge. The Gal Vorbak would pay the first price. Their bodies were changed, their minds were changed, their souls were no longer entirely their own, and eventually the price would become due. Because chaos does not give gifts, it makes investments. Every blessing has a cost. Every revelation has a price. Every demon bargain has a hidden clause, and eventually the word bearers would learn that the gods they worshipped did not love them, they used them. The same way the word bearers had used the populations they conquered, the same way Erebus used Horus, the same way Lorgar used his legion, and the same way the Emperor had used the Primarchs. Perhaps that is the true tragedy. Everyone in this story believes they are the one who understands the game. Almost everyone discovers that they were being played. Lorgar's final choice. Eventually Lorgar stands before the truth. He can turn away or he can embrace it. He chooses chaos. Not because he suddenly hates the Emperor, not because he wants to destroy humanity, but because he believes he has finally discovered the meaning he was searching for. That is what makes this choice so terrifying. He's not screaming, he's not raving, he's not simply consumed by rage. He's convinced. And he is convicted, and conviction can be more dangerous than hatred. What the word bearers became. The word bearers eventually became something almost unrecognizable from the legion that marched beneath the Emperor's banner. Their armor changes, their symbols change, their rituals change. Their chaplains become dark apostles, their temples become shrines to chaos, their sermons become invocations, their faith becomes weaponized, and their legion spreads across the galaxy, not merely conquering, converting, not merely killing or sacrificing, not merely fighting, summoning. The Legion, the 17th Legion, has come full circle. Once they were missionaries of the Imperial Truth, now they are missionaries of chaos. The seed of the heresy. Look at the galaxy now. The Emperor is still alive. The Great Crusade is still moving. Horus is still loyal. The legions still call themselves brothers. The heresy has not yet officially begun. But the foundations are already there. The word bearers have changed. The warrior lodges have spread. Erebus is waiting. Horus will soon be wounded. The anathema is waiting. Darwin is waiting. And somewhere in the darkness, the chaos gods are waiting, but the galaxy does not know it yet. But the war has already begun. It simply has not announced itself yet. The final irony. Lorgar wanted to illuminate humanity. That was his original mission. He wanted to show mankind the truth. He wanted to explain existence. He wanted to answer the question that science could not. And eventually he found the answer, but the answer consumed him. The man who wanted to save humanity from ignorance became one of the greatest agents of corruption in human history. The legion that wanted to spread enlightenment became the legion that spread chaos. The Primarch who worshipped the Emperor became the Primarch who taught humanity to worship the dark gods, and the city that symbolized his faith became the birthplace of his hatred. Monarchia was destroyed, but Lorgar survived. and that was the Emperor's mistake. The First Traitors. Epilogue. The word bearers were not the strongest legion, they were not the fastest, they were not the most numerous, they were not the greatest swordsmen either. But they understood something that almost nobody else did. Wars are not won only with weapons, they are won with ideas, belief, fear, loyalty, lies, and with faith. The word bearers had mastered all of them. They had spent decades preparing humanity for the possibility of gods. Then they discovered that gods were real. And the moment they found them, they stopped being servants of the Emperor. They became servants of something else. Something ancient. Something hungry. Something that had been waiting for humanity to open the door. And Lorgar opened it. The Emperor destroyed Monarchia to teach his son a lesson. Instead, he gave Lorgar a reason to search, and the word-bearers found what they were looking for. But there was one thing that had not yet been accomplished. They had not broken the War Master, not yet. For that, they would need a weapon, a world, a wounded Primarch, and a blade that carried the power of the warp. Its name was Darwin, and the man who would fall there was Horus. Thank you for watching this lore video. If you could like and subscribe to my channel for more, and the next episode we will be tackling the Emperor's Children, the price of perfection.